We're going to resume. Thank you for being back promptly. Buenas tardes, señora de Valdez, si están.
Good afternoon, Ms. de Valdez. If you could please read the statement you have before you. I hereby state on my honor and conscience that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you very much. Mr. Foster?
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Valdez, good afternoon.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Ms. de Valdez, do you have in front of you a copy of the statement you have submitted in this arbitration dated February 25th, 2011?
La traducción no se escucha.
I can't hear the translation.
Can you hear me now? The translation.
Ahora se escucha? Ahora.
No está escuchando la traducción. No. Can we do a test? Use este otro. Sí. ¿Lo escucha? Si watch it read, lo puede cambiar de lugar.
Ms. de Valdez, can you hear the translation now?
Sí, la escucho.
Yes, I do.
All right. Ms. de Valdez, do you have in front of you a copy of the statement you have submitted in this arbitration dated February 25th, 2011?
Sí.
Yes, I do.
And do you ratify that statement and affirm its truthfulness before the tribunal?
Sí.
Yes.
Ms. de Valdez, did you previously work for Mr. Hector Pinto?
Sí.
Yes.
And what did you do for him?
Era su secretaria.
I was his secretary and assistant.
How long did you work for Mr. Pinto?
Trabajé del año
I worked from 1976 to 2008 when he died.
And if I'm doing my math correctly, that would be approximately 32 years?
Así es.
That's right.
Now, during the 32 years that you worked for Mr. Pinto as his secretary, for whom did Mr. Pinto work?
Trabajaba para las
He worked for the Campollo companies.
And when you say the Campollo companies, are you referring to companies owned or controlled by Mr. Ramon Campollo?
Sí.
Yes.
And what were the names of some of the companies, the Campollo companies that Mr. Pinto worked for?
Primeramente fue GIES,
First it was Hiesa, then La Pequeña or Guatemala de Negocios, and finally Corporación Manatí.
Did Mr. Pinto also work on anything on a project known as Ciudad del Sur for Mr. Campollo?
sí, en
Yes, in Santa Lucia, Quetzalcoatl.
Now, what types of business did Mr. Pinto engage in on Mr. Campollo's behalf?
más que todo administrativo.
Mostly administrative.
Corporation Manatee, what kind of business did Corporation Manatee engage in?
Era un desarrollo.
It was real estate development.
Where were your and Mr. Pinto's offices located?
En la séptima avenida.
And 7th Avenue, 653, Zone 4 of Guatemala City, Triangle Building, Edificio Triángulo.
To your knowledge, who owned the office space where you and Mr. Pinto had offices?
Tengo entendido que don
It's my understanding that it's Don Ramon and his siblings.
Mr. Campoyo. Is that correct?
así es.
Yes, that's right.
Did Mr. Campoyo also have offices at the Triangle Building?
Sí,
Yes.
Now, during the 32 years that you worked for Mr. Pinto, did he communicate with Mr. Campoyo on a regular basis?
no muy ocasionalmente.
No, it was very much from time to time.
How did they typically communicate with each other?
Por medio de fax,
By fax, email, or telephone.
Did they on occasion have face-to-face meetings as well?
sí, pero muy ocasionalmente.
Yes, but very occasionally.
Do you recall Mr. Pinto having communications and discussions with representatives of Ferrovías Guatemala during 2005 and 2006?
Sí,
Yes.
And during that time, do you recall Mr. Pinto ever telling you that he was not authorized or no longer authorized by Mr. Campoyo to have such communications or discussions with Ferrovías?
Objection, Mr. President. I think Mr. Stern is going even beyond the scope of his own witness statement. I think it's improper scope for direct examination in this hearing.
Ms. de Valdez is responding to assertions made in the rejoinder, which we obviously did not have an opportunity to respond to in writing, by Mr. Campoyo about his authorization of Mr. Pinto to act on his behalf, and that's the basis for his testimony.
no, nunca supe de
No, I never found out about. Wait just a moment.
Could you please rephrase the question?
To your knowledge, was Mr. Pinto ever not authorized by Mr. Campoyo to have any communications or discussions with Ferrovías?
Same objection, Mr. President. Plus, it assumes facts that are not in evidence. He has not established that she knew that Mr. Campoyo actually authorized him to speak on behalf with Ferrovías.
Why don't you move on to your next question?
Did Mr. Pinto ever tell you that Mr. Campoyo was upset with him for ever having had unauthorized discussions with Ferrovías?
Mr. President, again, I'm sorry. Same subject, same objection.
This is her personal knowledge I'm asking her about. And again, it's in response to assertions made in the rejoinder and in the statement of Mr. Campoyo, to which we did not have an opportunity to respond.
Mr. President, if I may, as we all know, the subject of direct examination in these arbitrations here is limited. That is why statements are submitted in writing. If there were things that were within Ms. de Valdez's personal knowledge, she should have testified about them in writing. This is not the opportunity to broach new subjects with Ms. de Valdez, which we have not been put on notice about.
These are not new subjects. These are assertions they made in their submissions, in Mr. Campoyo's own testimony. They submitted something in late October that we saw for the first time, and that is why we are responding at this time to those assertions.
Yes, you are responding to that, but the issue here is not whether the assertion has been made or not, but whether the witness had made that type of assertion in the witness statement.
And my response to that is that she did not have an opportunity to make that response because it was raised in the rejoinder, and we did not have an opportunity to respond in writing to the rejoinder.
If I can try and be helpful, something I'm not used to. In her statement, she asserts that there was communications by email in the course of business between Mr. Pinto and, inter alia, Mr. Posner. Can you really take it much further than that?
If the question is whether my question is within the scope of her original statement, the answer is no. But again, my questions are directed to assertions made in the rejoinder by Mr. Campoyo, to which she is responding to.
Well, to get out of the issue, the tribunal is going to ask the question right now. So, tendré que, le haré la misma pregunta.
I'll ask the same question, but you'll have to help me out. The computer I have right in front of me isn't working. Let's see, maybe I can read it right here. It's further up.
Si la pregunta es much further up.
I would ask. I would simply ask, did she have any reason to think that these communications were not authorized?
La pregunta es si usted tiene.
The question is whether you had any knowledge of the communications with Ferrovías not being authorized at the time. No, I never had any such information.
Ms. de Valdez, do you recall Mr. Pinto ever having discussions or communications with Mr. Campoyo regarding Ferrovías?
Objection again goes beyond the scope of her direct
Sí.
examination. And Mr. President, if I may, the claimant seemed to be trying to rewrite a witness statement that was presented months ago. We understood and were proceeding under the assumption that the direct testimony was the direct testimony presented in writing by the witnesses. If we are now going to have witnesses testify about additional subjects not covered in their direct testimony, I think we will be in a very different proceeding that will take significantly longer than we had originally planned.
as a general matter, to move the proceedings forward, is that you restrict the questions to what is in the witness's statement.
Okay, thank you. I just have one final question, Ms. Valdez. Was Mr. Pinto still working for Mr. Campoyo at the time of his death in January of 2008?
Sí.
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Ord, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Valdez, good morning.
Buenos días.
Sorry, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am going to ask you some questions about the questions that you just answered for Mr. Stern, if that is okay with you. You spoke, and Mr. Stern asked you about your working relationship with Mr. Pinto. Remember those questions?
Sí.
Yes, that I was his secretary and assistant.
With Mr. Pinto, not Mr. Campoyo, correct?
Así es.
That is correct.
What
Mr.
Mr.
Salinas, I will ask you to make a pause because of the translation. We need to have
Yes,
some time.
thank you. I'm
Thanks.
sorry. You were also asked about the responsibilities that Mr. Pinto had for Mr. Campoyo. Remember those questions?
Sí.
Yes?
Other businesses aside from his work for Mr. Campoyo, isn't that correct?
Sí, en lo personal.
Yes, as a personal matter, but they were small businesses, bicycle sales, spare parts, pumps for fumigation.
Or even in the El Triángulo building, correct?
Sí.
Yes, on the first floor. The stores were on the first floor.
For example, you said he had a bike business, a bike sales business.
Así es.
That's right.
You described Mr. Pinto's obligations within the businesses of Mr. Campoyo as administrative, correct?
Así es.
That is correct.
You did not describe them as Mr. Pinto being a representative of Mr. Campoyo, is that correct?
He trabajado.
He worked as general manager in Corporación Manatí.
Sí.
Yes, he was general manager of that company.
But Mr. Pinto didn't speak for Mr. Campoyo for all matters, correct?
No, no. Solo en algunas.
No, just on certain occasions when he would entrust him with something to do. Then I imagine he would go in his representation.
When you say encomendaban, you mean when Mr. Pinto was told to represent him by Mr. Campoyo, is that correct?
Sí.
Yes.
So, if Mr. Campoyo would have told Pinto not to do something, Mr. Pinto would have been expected not to do it, correct?
Así es.
That's right, but I was never aware whether he on some occasion told him that he was not going to participate in a given business. I never knew that.
Mr. Valdez, I'm showing you on the screen a document that has been presented in this arbitration. Kelby, would we be able to show her the Spanish version of this letter, please? Yes, Professor Crawford.
I would object to to showing her this document. It's not within the scope of her direct, and it's not addressed even in her witness statement. I would also add that respondent chose not to list Ms. de Valdez as a witness it intended to cross-examine, and therefore his questions, counsel's questions, should be limited only to the scope of her direct testimony today.
My response, Mr. President, is that this goes directly to the President's question to Ms. de Valdez and her testimony right now on cross-examination. I certainly am allowed to confront her with documents arising from her answers to my questions.
And I don't see how any of her answers to the questions posed by counsel lead to the introduction of this document.
And again, I'll leave it at this, but she said I was not aware of. And this is precisely the evidence that what she was not aware of actually happened.
Again, I don't see the connection between the two.
I think we believe that the letter is obvious by itself. I mean, I don't think you need to reinforce that with the witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll move on. Mr. Valdez, you spoke of the Edificio El Triángulo, correct?
Sí.
Yes.
Is it your testimony before this tribunal today, under oath, that that building belongs to Mr. Campollo in its entirety?
No me consta que sea.
I don't have personal knowledge that it is entirely his, but some of the offices have his businesses and are his.
But not the entire building, correct?
Así es.
That's right.
You were asked about emails that you sent on behalf of Mr. Pinto to Mr. Sen, Posner, and I believe Mr. Dugan as well. You remember those questions?
Sí.
Yes.
You list those emails in paragraph 5 of your written statement, which you have before you, right? Correct?
Sí.
Yes.
You didn't copy Mr. Campollo on any of those emails. Is that correct?
I would again object.
Sí.
This is not within the scope of her direct testimony. He's referring to her statement, and she did not testify on her direct about emails Mr. Pinto sent to Ferrovias.
I'm sorry, but I'm fairly certain that Mr. Stern specifically asked her whether she had sent emails to Mrs. Posner, Dugan, and Sen on behalf of Mr. Pinto.
I did not ask her any question like that on direct.
We think that the question should be limited to whom, copied the emails that she sent. But the question that had been asked was whether Mr. Pinto was communicating, how often was communicating with Mr. Campollo. That was really the question that was being asked.
And perhaps I misremember, Mr. President, but if that's the tribunal's recollection, my recollection is that she was asked if she had sent emails on behalf of Mr. Pinto to Mrs. Posner, Dugan, and Sen. But if that's the tribunal
we can
record,
check the record.
that's fine, Mr. President. I don't think there's any need. I think the emails speak for themselves. And Mr. Valdez, unless my colleagues tell me otherwise, this will be my last question. You were asked by Mr. Stern about how Mr. Pinto would communicate with Mr. Campollo. Is that correct?
Sí.
Yes.
And you mentioned that they communicated sometimes via fax. Is that correct?
Ajá. Sí.
Yes.
This despite that your testimony is that they are located in the same building. Is that correct?
Sí.
Yes.
you also mentioned via telephone, correct?
Sí.
Yes.
And you also said that they sometimes communicated in person, but only very occasionally. Is that correct?
Sí.
Yes, that is correct.
I have no further questions, Mr. President.
Thank you.
No, Stuart first.
Yes, you go first this time.
Ms. Valdez, the relationship between Mr. Pinto and Mr. Campayo is an important issue in this matter. So permit me to ask you a few questions based on your long association with Mr. Pinto.
Está bien.
That's okay.
You mentioned that Mr. Pinto was the general manager with respect to one of Mr. Campayo's companies, I believe. Is that correct?
Sí, es correcto.
Yes, that is correct.
Do you know whether or not they worked together on the possible development of the Ciudad del Sur real estate development in the south coast of Guatemala?
Sí.
Yes.
And in what way did you understand they worked together on that project?
When Mr. Hector had to do something about Ciudad del Sur, he asked for authorization to Mr. Ramon or Mr. Ritter, who was his brother, to make any progress on that project.
This was a project on which, to your knowledge, they worked together. That is, that Mr. Pinto worked with Mr. Campayo on that project.
Sí.
Yes.
Do you know what his duties were with respect to that particular project on behalf of Mr. Campayo?
I do not know their direct responsibilities, but he was dealing with the progress made in the project, and for example, in case of ferrovías and land transportation, the idea was to use Tecnológico del Sur and also to create a free zone in the south, in Ciudad del Sur.
Were they also interested in the railroad development in that area? The development and extension of the railroad to the Ciudad area?
Sí.
Yes, because that was going to be good for the transportation of sugar to the port.
And this is something you knew of by your association with Mr. Pinto and by looking at various correspondence? How did you know that that was the purpose of the development?
Por,
Because of the situation and because I sometimes saw the correspondence written by Mr. Pinto, I used to write it, or maybe he made a comment to me about what the intention was behind that project.
And Mr. Campayo had sugar interests in that area?
sí.
Yes, that was the sugar mill Mar de Tierra, but I am not sure about his participation. I know that he has some interest in Mar de Tierra, but I'm not so sure how big that interest is.
To your knowledge, did Mr. Pinto have the confidence of Mr. Campayo and his associations with him?
Sí.
Yes.
in your experience, if he said to a third party that he was representing Mr. Campayo, would that, in your experience, have been generally the case or not the case?
Sí.
Yes.
Now, I asked you whether it would or wouldn't be the case. Which would it be? That is, would he normally, if he said he was working for Mr. Campayo, in fact, be representing him on that particular issue? Was their relationship such that, in your experience, that if Mr. Pinto said to a third party that he was working on behalf of or extending proposals on behalf of Mr. Campayo, that that would have been the case?
Sí.
Yes.
And what makes you answer in that way?
Because he often told me I am going to do such a thing. Mr. Campoyo asked me to do such and such a thing. Let's write a note or something else. That's the reason why, but in general terms, he did not offer me any further explanations.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Mr. Pinto used to sell bicycles, I understand.
Can you say that again, please?
Mr. Pinto used to sell bicycles, I understand.
Sí.
Yes, that was part of his business.
What else did he do in that line?
Vendía.
He sold spare parts, tires for motorcycles, tires for vehicles, and plants for pesticides, and pumps for pesticides.
So he had a substantial business of his own.
Pues
It wasn't so substantial. It was a small business, but his sons were the ones in charge of those sales.
Is it an accurate description of what you've said, that he acted in relation to the Ciudad project on instructions from Mr. Campoyo on each occasion?
¿a qué?
What are you referring to with your question?
You said that he would receive instructions from Mr. Campoyo to do certain things, and I was asking whether it followed from that when he did things for Mr. Campoyo, he was doing so on instructions on that occasion.
Sí.
Yes.
Mr. Stern?
I have no further questions.
Mr. Salinas?
I do very briefly, Mr. President. Ms. De Valdez, just a couple of more questions, if you don't mind. On the tribunal's questions.
On the tribunal's question.
Yes, Mr. President. Ms. De Valdez, you were asked by Secretary Eisenstadt some questions about whether Mr. Pinto and Mr. Campoyo worked together in Ciudad del Sur. Do you remember those questions?
Sí.
Yes.
Now, you don't know what participation, if any, Mr. Pinto had in Ciudad del Sur, correctly? Correct?
Yes, I don't know.
Now, you were also asked, as a matter of fact, just now by Professor Crawford, the arbitrator sitting to your farthest to your left, that whether a logical extension of your testimony before this tribunal was that when Mr. Pinto did things or purported to do things for Mr. Campoyo, he was doing so on Mr. Campoyo's instructions. Remember that question? That was the last question that was just asked of you.
Sí.
Yes.
Now, what you knew about Mr. Pinto's conversations with Mr. Campollo was coming from Mr. Pinto, isn't that correct?
Sí,
Yes.
You didn't ask Mr. Campollo if he was acting on his instructions, correct?
no, no.
No, I never asked him that.
In meetings between Mr. Pinto and Mr. Campollo about instructions that Mr. Campollo might or might not be giving Mr. Pinto, is that correct?
Sí,
Yes.
Nor were you present during calls between Mr. Pinto and Mr. Campollo, is that correct?
sí,
Yes.
Perhaps you would have received faxes from Mr. Campollo to Mr. Pinto, is that correct?
sí,
Yes.
And you're not aware of any fax from Mr. Campollo to Mr. Pinto instructing him to negotiate with Ferrovías before or after April 15, 2005, is that correct?
sí,
Yes.
Correct that you're not aware of any facts of that type, correct? I just want the record to be
No.
clear, I apologize.
No. I never saw that fax.
Knowledge, no such fax exists, correct?
no.
Not that I remember.
It goes beyond
I've,
what had been asked,
and just for the record, the word fax when used was F-A-X. I'm told it's incorrectly transcribed. But that is the end of my intervention, Mr. President.
thank you. Señora de Valdés, mucho.
Thank you very much, Ms. Valdez. You're excused.